Good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, can I thank you for your kind invitation to speak with you and also to listen to your perspectives on Brexit in this absolutely beautiful location of St. Andrews. Now, when I was looking at the agenda, I saw that I am speaking in the Robbie Burns room. And I'm of a generation in Ireland that is familiar with his poems and his songs. And while it's old hat to you, I thought it might be appropriate if I would start with an insightful quote from the Scottish bard. And it's from his poem, "To a Mouse on Turning Up Her Nest with the Plough." Here, Burns laments his inadvertent action, his unintentional action of destroying the nest that was so painstakingly built, and especially given that winter is approaching and there's no time to rebuild it. He then extrapolates that event to a universal truth, and I quote, "But mouse, you are not alone in proving foresight may be vain. The best laid plans of mice and men go often askew and leave us nothing but grief and pain for promised joy." And I ask myself, could this be the outcome of Brexit for all of us? Grief and pain for promised joy. Now, perhaps that sounds too alarmist, and maybe it's just a response to finding myself in the Robbie Burns room. But as we all know, Burns was rarely wide of the mark. I'm given about 40 minutes, but I intend to speak for about 25 to leave time for contributions. And in that time, I want to concentrate on 4 issues. First of all, the timetable, the countdown to Brexit. Secondly, the view from the European Parliament as articulated in its political statements. Thirdly, the Irish backstop. What is it and how might it work? And finally, my own perspective on Brexit. And I have to warn you that in the very best Irish and Scottish tradition, it's a bit of a lament. So first, the timetable. And with the acceleration of negotiations in recent days, already people are sort of beginning to quietly ask, are we there yet? Well, we're not. But first of all, who are the main players and what's happening now? Well, as you know, at the highest level, it's Barnier, Raab, and May. Barnier is in constant contact with the European Council via 2 avenues: the European ambassadors from each member state and a group called the Sherpas, men and women, one from each member state, that have the ear of the Prime Minister. Barnier also links to the Parliament via the Brexit Steering Group. The chair of that group is Guy Verhofstadt, who's a former Belgian Prime Minister, and he's leader of the group that I sit with in the Parliament, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats. That group liaises with the Parliament on a constant basis, and we have drawn up 4 political statements in the last 18 months on Brexit. Barnier, of course, represents the European Commission, and they're in constant contact where plans and policies and texts are drafted and redrafted. Barnier is also very accessible. He has visited every member state, sometimes some member states a few times, and just yesterday he actually spoke with over 600 representatives of chambers of commerce from all across the EU in the Parliament in Brussels. I wasn't there, but I believe he received a standing ovation at the end of it. Now, I don't intend to detail the UK players because you're familiar with who they are and what's happening. So the timetable. This week, beneath the surface, at a second level, as it were, progress is being made. Ollie Robbins with Sabine Wieland, who's the deputy EU negotiator, are trying to reach agreement on issues like Cyprus, Gibraltar, etc. The EU ambassadors have met the Commission to try and lay the groundwork for the political decisions that may be taken by the Council and, where possible, organise the choreography. Barnier and Verhofstadt met Arlene Foster yesterday, and last week they met all of the other parties in Northern Ireland. As we speak here today, progress is being made on the Irish backstop, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And if sufficient agreement is reached now and over this weekend, the EU ambassadors and the Sherpas will start to flesh out the political declaration, which of course will have been pre-cooked with the UK. That political declaration has then to go hand in hand with a withdrawal agreement. Next Tuesday, EU affairs ministers will meet in Brussels to try and draft summit conclusions. And then, on Wednesday, a dinner of all heads of government of 28 member states will hear a presentation from Theresa May. She will leave, and after that, discussions will continue. And if they make what they call clear progress, then they'll call another summit for November. And in the meantime, it will be detail, 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 but we will have agreed political statements. Otherwise, we are staring down the barrel of a hard no deal, or at best, some cobbled together last-minute arrangement to avoid chaos for all of us. I haven't and won't speak now about the possibility of maybe a further transition period or a second referendum, because right now they are not on the table. If there's agreement in November, then both the European Parliament and the House of Commons will have to give their consent, and then and only then do we have final agreement. The second issue that I mentioned that I would give you is just a very quick perspective of the Parliament on Brexit. And I'm just going to give you 5 or 6 headline sentences which outlines the views of the Parliament, and of course were voted by a huge majority on 4 different occasions. First of all, any international agreement on the new relationship between the EU and the UK can only be formally negotiated after the UK leaves. Secondly, any such agreement must fully protect the internal market, etc., etc. Also, the European Parliament will have to approve any future EU-UK trade agreement. There's actually nothing new there. We had to approve the Canada trade agreement, the Korea trade agreement, etc. The Parliament recognises that it's in the mutual interest of the EU and the UK to establish a partnership that ensures continued security cooperation to face common threats such as terrorism and organised crime. The Parliament is insistent on citizens' rights being maintained. I won't give you the detail, you probably know most of them. And finally, and again I'm paraphrasing here, it supports the Irish backstop, that the Good Friday Agreement is upheld in all its parts, and the continuation of peace funds. So there's nothing really new, but again, just to emphasise, support from the vast majority of the Parliament. And so, to the Irish backstop. How did we get here? Last December, the EU and the UK agreed on a joint report stating that if no other solution could be found on the Irish border, Northern Ireland would remain in regulatory alignment with the EU, and that those rules that contribute to North-South cooperation, the all-island economy, and the Good Friday Agreement would continue to apply. At that time, the UK undertook that there would be no new barriers between Northern Ireland and the UK. But that's, of course, an internal UK matter and is predicated on the agreement of the Northern Ireland Assembly, which isn't up and running at the moment, but actually could change that if they wanted. It's also worth noting that at that time, the Irish Prime Minister described this agreement as bulletproof. So we needed proposals and a legal text to make this agreement bulletproof. Initially, the idea of keeping Northern Ireland as a single regulatory unit with the Republic was floated, part of the customs territory with checks at ports. But obviously, Theresa May strongly rejected that, saying no British Prime Minister could agree to it. And then we moved to what we call the de-dramatisation of the Irish border. And we are inching or centimetering our way along that tortuous path. You'll be relieved that I won't rehash every step. I'll just come to where we are today. The proposals at the moment, as far as I know, are that the EU, this is in regard to Northern Ireland, that the EU is considering dual certification for Northern Ireland goods, so that goods produced in Northern Ireland could move freely between both the UK and the EU. As such, those goods would have full access to the single market. Northern Ireland goods would have to comply with EU and obviously UK standards, and certification would be carried out by barcoding and market surveillance checks. Already, as you know, there are checks on animal movement between Britain and Northern Ireland. But as far as the island, and those of course would continue, but as far as the island of Ireland is concerned, that is a single unit for livestock movements right now. Another proposal is that goods coming to the Northern Ireland from Britain could be checked at Dublin Port for EU compliance. Right now, actually, 60% of goods from Britain destined for Northern Ireland come through Dublin. Obviously, this means that UK companies would have to fill out customs declarations online and in advance. And that means, if it works, and it should, screening barcodes would be what we would be involved in. And that could be done on ferries or transit ports. In essence, this would give Northern Ireland a position not enjoyed by any other part of a third country, and that is access to the single market and, crucially, the ability to benefit from any current or future EU trade deals. And I'll just give you one example. I live near the border, and dotted across the Irish border, we have a number of huge dairy facilities where milk from both sides of the border, for good economic reasons, which I won't explain here, is mixed and moves from there. Ireland is the largest supplier of baby milk formula to China. That could continue under these arrangements. That's just one example. However, it's reported, and I'm relying on the newspapers for this today, that I've heard it before, that the UK wants any backstop for customs rules to apply to the UK as a whole. So there would be no need for any customs checks on goods to Northern Ireland. In other words, the backstop could become the back door for access to the single market. In my opinion, that just cannot happen. Number one, the backstop has to be legally guaranteed, no time limit. So for a start, that's not possible. And secondly, of course, it's pulling apart the single market. I don't believe other European countries would agree to that. So in a way, that's the crux of the matter right now. And that's where we are. At one level, solutions are within our grasp, but we're skating on very thin ice. So finally, the sad bit at the end. My lament, my own perspective on Brexit. Ladies and gentlemen, I am heartbroken by Brexit, and at so many different levels. Starting with the big picture, the EU is the second largest economy in the world. We're almost on a par with the US. That gives us strength and influence globally, and we are about to lose a hugely important partner. So why does that matter? The EU leads globally on so many important issues. The EU leads on climate change. Marguerite Vestager and the EU lead on tax justice, that multinationals pay their fair share of tax. Yes, that's an issue for Ireland, but it's something we have to do. The US economy is booming at the moment, and yet I read that for the first time since the end of World War II, the percentage of wealth, or GDP, that goes to labor is less than 60%. That's unsustainable, and multinationals paying their fair share of tax is part of that solution to the problem where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. The EU leads on data protection. The new currency won't be pounds or euro. In many ways, the new currency is information, and we need it protected. The US or the Chinese won't protect it, but we have legislation to protect it. The EU leads on development aid. The EU leads on ensuring quality and traceable food, on environmental protection, the use of pesticides, provision of clean water, the preservation of habitats. The EU leads on health and safety at work, and in our trade deals, we make some efforts, at least, to try to export basic labor conditions for those countries that we do business with. Now, I know it sounds like the EU can do nothing wrong. Well, it can, and it has. But the overall direction of travel, in my opinion, is in the right direction. And that's crucial for the world that we live in. And we all live in this world. And events that happen elsewhere, about which we know very little and we have absolutely no control, impact on our lives. And in my opinion, the EU acts as an anchor, or can act at least, as an anchor and a beacon. I'll give you one example. 2 weeks ago in Strasbourg, we passed a copyright directive. Now, there's already laws around that, but in the digital age, people's intellectual property is simply not protected. Spain tried to do that 3 years ago, and Facebook said to them, adios, we're out of here. But when the EU does that, Facebook and Google and Amazon listen and comply for a very simple reason. They need to sell to us. We are their customers. It's always been the case that you follow the money. No one country in Europe can do this, but together we can. And now the UK, who has been a strong and stable partner in what Barack Obama called the finest human achievement of the 20th century. Now, you are leaving us, and in my view, we'll all be worse off. And at the day-to-day mundane level, as an Irish MEP, I'm going to miss UK MEPs. We didn't agree on everything, but there's a real shared view of the world. You're a pragmatic, you're a down-to-earth people, and you provide a counterweight to what I'd call continental influences. That balance in Europe will be tilted, and that'll change things, and not for the better. In the EU institutions, you're a large country. You carried weight by virtue of your size, your economy, and your influence. You did a lot of the heavy lifting for us in Ireland on many issues, and we'll miss that. And from the perspective of peace in Northern Ireland, I am concerned. The Chief Constable of the PSNI has stated recently that they are stretched right now trying to keep things together. Any escalation of unrest, smuggling, illegal activities, disputes only goes in one direction. And while I'm hopeful that because of the peace process, Sinn Féin's involvement in politics, the involvement of communities and cross-community projects, etc., that things won't fall apart. But it's a worrying time. And from the perspective of community, you are our neighbours and our friends, and the family connections are strong. Those bonds have strengthened during our time together as EU members, and they have been stabilised by the Good Friday Agreement and by the visit of Queen Elizabeth II to Ireland and visits of the Irish President to the UK. Oh yes, we are still delighted to beat what we call the old enemy in Twickenham, or inflict defeat on the Flowers of Scotland in Murrayfield. But we are still happy to go for a drink afterwards to toast the victor, whoever it is, and promise ourselves that we'll do this again next year. And equally, we are proud and happy to stand with you, beating the Yanks in the Ryder Cup in Gleneagles or anywhere else in Europe. So I won't finish on a low note, but I'll finish as I started, by quoting Robbie Burns. And this time, perhaps, his best-known poem, Auld Lang Syne. And not only for old times, but for times to come, I hope and believe that when Brexit is done, we can still drink a cup of kindness yet for the sake of Auld Lang Syne.